So, welcome to the Spiritual Hour with myself, Global Psychic Medium. And in today's podcast, Ep.2, we're going to be talking about trauma and the awakening. Now, I want to share some of my personal stories around my traumas, but also how my awakening helped me to learn how to heal and how to overcome some of the obstacles that I've been facing. Now, we are going to be talking about some sensitive issues in today's podcast. So I just wanted to make that very clear right from the beginning. Now, one of my traumas that I had to overcome was abandonment. Now, abandonment comes in many, many forms. It could be an absent mother, an absent father, etc., etc. For me, it was a little bit different. For me, at around 10 months old, my mum basically couldn't look after me anymore. My dad had got himself into a little bit of trouble, let's say, and he went away for a while. And because he went away for a while, my mum basically took me into social services and says, I can't have him anymore. And she just dropped me off at social services at 10 months old. And I was there from, in care by the way, I was in care from the age of 10 months up to about 4.5, give or take. So I had several foster parents and several times in and out of children's homes. So, you know, there was issues growing up of around feeling wanted and feeling loved. And, you know, there was a lot of things that didn't feel right to me growing up. Now, for a long time, I held a lot of anger with this, particularly at the time where I mentioned last week that I'd gone through a lot of my social services records. So when I had my breakdown, which was somewhere in my 30s, when I had my breakdown, I started going through a lot of my social services files, trying to piece together things that had been missing for me, things that I just couldn't remember certain parts of my life. I'd obviously blocked a lot of things out. And as I started to go through them, obviously the first thing that was jumping off the page was abandoned. And I remember that when I read those words, because I didn't remember everything, as you can imagine, I absolutely spiraled, which made my breakdown even worse. Inside, I felt lost. I felt just completely unwanted, unloved, unnurtured, uncared for. There were so many feelings that I'd been going through. Now, at this particular time, I hadn't spoke to my parents for years. And so there was this horrible feeling that I'd been going through, and it just sent me down into this dark kind of path of trying to understand, why didn't they want me? Why didn't my mum want me? Why did she send me away? And all these feelings that I had around this. Mental health wise, it impacted me massively in a way that I probably couldn't put into words. And this obviously has an impact, obviously, as an adult, of course. So there was a lot of feelings around that of how that made me feel as a grown man. And obviously having my own children, I couldn't understand how someone could just easily just kind of give you up at the time. Now, Spirit said to me later on, through my awakening, things are not the way that you see it. So it's not the way that it seems. I'm like, okay. But at the time, I'm just a raging mess. So obviously I'm feeling very angry, very upset. As I'm going through a lot of my social services files, I began to get a lot of flashbacks. So as I'm starting to read some of the things off the paper, things I may have forgotten or kind of put to the back of my mind, all of a sudden I'm starting to get these visions, I'm starting to get these flashbacks, and I'm starting to remember things that I probably didn't want to remember. And, whether it was my dad being very heavy-handed, probably overly so, which happened later on in life, or whether it be, again, just focusing on some of the other traumas that I'd also gone through. Now, as you can imagine, this obsession of going through these hundreds and hundreds of pages of files became just an obsession every single day. I'd kind of lay them all out on the bed, try and put them in some sort of order. I was taking notes from them, trying to understand everything that was going on, trying to understand who my foster parents was, almost trying to find where I belonged, wanted to try and reach out and contact these people, asked if they had photos of me, maybe when I was growing up, asked what kind of child I was growing up. So there were so many questions that I had going through my head. So I had all these things that I needed or wanted to ask, all these things that I needed a piece in my head to put together. Now, one of the places that I went to, so there was a place that I went to as foster parents where there was not, I would say, not the greatest people, is probably an understatement. And when I was about 3 years old, the gentleman did some quite terrible things. And I can only say it in a way where I don't want to trigger anyone, but let's say he did some quite terrible things that I went through and I was only 3 years old. Now, that was something that I had a lot of flashbacks. There was tons of flashbacks, and it was something as an adult I was really, really struggling with. It was something that was written all over my social services files, things that the social service was aware I was saying strange things, I was making strange comments about things that I probably shouldn't have been making around the age of 3 or 4, let's say. And those things wasn't followed up, so unfortunately I was let down massively by social services at the time. I should have been more protected. And one of the other memories that I have from being at that particular place, I remember it being Christmas time, and I remember the Christmas tree up at the bottom of the stairs at this particular property where I was. And I remember that I had my arms being pulled either side, and my parents was pulling one arm and the foster parents was pulling the other. So I pretty much had two people on one arm, two people on the other, was pulling me apart. And I remember literally screaming out that it was obviously hurting me quite a lot. And it was a memory that has stayed with me for a long, long time. And I didn't understand what it was because it was a memory from when I was younger. And again, when I started to go through some of my files, I understood then that my parents was meant to come to visit me to drop off a Christmas present, but the foster parent was being awkward about it. And because that they wanted to adopt me, and all of a sudden it had changed, they was no longer able to adopt me because apparently I had to, there was some other sort of snags with this, but apparently they couldn't adopt me. And so the foster parent was quite annoyed or quite angry, and basically kind of, decided that my parents was not going to see me and they was going to block me in some way, block my parents in some way. And so obviously my parents came to the door at that particular point and there was arguing and things like that. So it was something that I remember being in the middle of and literally being pulled apart. And I remember being at that particular place, and when I was leaving that place, all I could say, it was maybe February, maybe March. And I remember having my bags and sitting on the doorstep. And again, reading through my files, I found out what actually happened was I was basically told to leave the house with my bags, and I was sitting out on the front doorstep on my own, waiting for social services to pick me up. At the time when I was this little boy of 4 years old, basically being kicked out this house, and instead of it being a proper handover and a safe handover, because there was all these sort of anger and frustration around this placement, what was meant to be an adoption, which thankfully it wasn't, of course. it ended with me sitting on a doorstep with my bag, waiting for social services to come and pick me up. So again, this was something that was really difficult for me to process, particularly as an adult, to understand why somebody would be the way that they was. Why would that be like that? Why would anybody treat a child like that? And why would anyone do that to a child as well? Now, moving just slightly on, just a little bit, I then went back to live with my parents, say about the age of 4.5. And when I went back to live with my parents, it was quite difficult. My dad was very, very strict. I mean, mum, she had polio and epilepsy, so she wasn't as fully abled as, let's say, somebody else. She wasn't fully abled. So when I was back at the house, my dad was, let's just say, someone that ran with an iron fist. Is probably the best way I can describe it, how he ran the house. And I would have lists of chores as long as my arms. And, if it wasn't doing one lot of chores, it was doing another lot of chores. But he was also someone that was really, really heavy-handed, which left marks on me more than one time in my life, which, again, things that was reported to social services at the time. And again, things that they probably should have followed up at the time, but didn't necessarily follow up at the time. So there was a lot of kind of backwards and forwards between being back at my parents and the way that my dad in particular was quite heavy-handed around us. His punishments was let's just say a different level. I remember being grounded once for the whole summer, which was back then 7 or 8 weeks, and I would basically have to stay in my bedroom for the whole 8 weeks and wasn't able to come down, only for dinner. And as soon as I'd finished my dinner, I had to go straight back to my bedroom. So he was someone that was completely over strict and completely sort of dominating in many, many ways. So there was a lot of fear around me dad and the way that he would react if we didn't do as he said or when he said it, let's say. Now, obviously, growing up a little bit more in this difficult environment, being back at my mum and dad's, obviously having to fit into rules that just felt more enforced in a way that was just more than it should ever have been. And then we come a little bit further on. And I got to about the age of 9, something like that. And what I'd also gone through as a 3-year-old, I ended up going through again from 9 till the age of 11. So it went on for 2 years. And as you can imagine, it was very, very difficult for me to even speak it even now. But I've got to a point in my life where I realised that the shame isn't with me, the guilt isn't with me. I didn't do anything wrong. I was a young child who was taken advantage of in the wrong way, and I wasn't protected in the way that I should have been protected by all the authorities around me. And obviously I was told by this person that was doing these things to me, no one will ever believe you. If you tell anyone, I'm going to do this to you, I'm going to do that to you. So again, there was a lot of fear around that. And eventually, he was then put in prison for around 2 years, something like that. So he did get put in prison. However, with that, my dad in particular just wouldn't believe me. He just wouldn't believe me that this had happened to me. And every time I mentioned it to him, he would get more angry and angry and angry and then threaten to hit me again. And so it got to the point where I was even scared to say anything, even though this person had been convicted. So it just became really, really difficult. Anyway, after a little while, after we've got through this court thing, he's got put aside. Then for me, it went quiet for a little while. But then all of a sudden, things started to change. So this person started sending letters through the post, and we'd moved to make sure we wasn't in the same place where we used to be. And then they started sending letters, so somehow found out where we lived. And again, made it very, very uncomfortable. So by this time, I'm probably around 14. And I'm around 14, so, a young lad just finding my feet. And all of a sudden, there's these troubled letters that are coming through. And then it gets to a point where I get home from school one day and I walk in from school, and the person that did these things to me when I was younger was sitting there on my sofa in my mum and dad's house, which to my absolute shock and horror, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Not only was I not being protected by my parents, but I wasn't being protected either by social services, because again, they was aware of this and aware of this situation, which then put me in a whole different place. It was very difficult. It was like I was told to put up and shut up, and wasn't able to really speak what I wanted to say, which made it really, really difficult for me, because I was scared. As you can imagine, I was scared. Obviously, this person had gone to prison for what he'd done, but I was scared of what he may do to me again. And then he started threatening to put posters round the estate, telling people that I'd been a child that had been abused, which you can imagine as a 14-year-old kid was probably the last thing that I ever wanted anybody to know at the time, because again, you're just a young lad, and young kids don't know how to understand what you've gone through and what you're going through. So it was a really, really difficult period in my life. Then we get to a part, maybe a few months after he's been sitting in my house, and one day I'm told that I have to get in the car with my dad and this man, and I have to go to the police station, and I have to change my statement. I have to go and change my statement and say that the things that he did, he didn't do, because he wanted his conviction sort of squashed. And I was told that I had no choice to do this. So again, I had no choice to get in that car, go to the police station, and basically say what he did, he didn't do. Later on, I find out through police and a connection around the police that the police was aware that they felt that I'd been backed into a corner. They felt like I'd been forced to do this. The letter had been on the desk for 10, 20 years or been filed. Been in there a long time. But again, social services or the police, there was no one there to protect me again. So I was pushed into this situation and was forced to say these things that wasn't true, that he hadn't done it when he had, of course. And it was a really, really difficult time for me. Then, at this particular point, shortly after this, I decide enough's enough. And I decide that I can't take being at home in the way it was. And there was a big fallout between me and my dad. And I remember he'd hit me, and he told me that, get a bath, get bed, you're grounded. And I remember I looked at the front door and I thought, I'm gone. And so I literally opened the front door, walked out. That was it. I left, and I ended up in a hostel that night, which was a really uncomfortable experience, because by then I was 16. So it was a really uncomfortable experience. But by this point, I'd not finished school, so I'd not gone through all my exams, and I'd left all of my um, coursework at my mum and dad's and never ever handed it in. So that affected my grades a lot, but I wasn't prepared to go back and get them. Obviously, from there, I then grow into a young adult where I suppose I've got some anger issues by then, and always felt lonely, always felt isolated quite a lot. Um, but I definitely had some anger issues, and growing up from there, I kind of turned into a person that, because there was a lot of physical growing up and a lot of bullying as well from kids at school and things like that when I was younger, I got to a point where everything changed in there, and I got to the point where I weren't going to take stuff anymore. And so there was a lot of anger inside of me. And I'd kind of grown into this person that was never going to allow anybody else to ever take advantage of me in any way, shape, or form. This is where things start to change in the story. So, yes, there was tons of depression, and I mean tons of it. There was days where I didn't go out. I the best way to put it, the way I put it to my partner before we met was I was too scared to go out because I was so angry that I didn't know what I was going to do to myself or to anybody else. So I was so, I was kind of a lot like that. And so I felt like it was best that I stayed at home so I didn't react to a situation or a person that didn't deserve it, of course. And it's just because I had all this anger going through me. So I'd spend 4, 5, 6 days at a time just at home. It affected my work. Obviously, I wasn't able to go to work. I was really struggling with my mental health. I was having a lot of flashbacks, so it was CPTSD. So PTSD is when there's been one thing that's happened to you in general. So it could be one event, one situation that's happened that's caused some trauma. CPTSD is when there's been several traumas over a length of time. And so that's where mine was, CPTSD, several traumas over several times. So my flashbacks was awful. Songs would trigger me. Smells would trigger me. A certain name would trigger me. Even certain programs on the TV would trigger me. And I mean massively, really trigger me. To the point that, if my partner was to put some of those programs on, I would just walk out and go in the next room because I was so scared there was going to be a storyline on the TV that connected to part of my childhood and my traumas. And I didn't want to relive it and take myself back there, which was really difficult for me. So at this particular point, I've started doing some counselling. So at this point, I've probably been going through maybe 6, maybe 8, maybe even 10 counsellors, but there was a lot of counsellors. Some that I just couldn't connect with. I didn't like the way that they spoke to me or the way that they probed me. I felt uncomfortable with some of them until I met, well, actually there was 2, but one of them, it was a long-term counsellor. And the other one was a short-term counsellor, but 2 people that I finally felt comfortable with to open up and talk about the traumas in the way that I needed to help me to process some of these things. Now, bearing in mind at this particular time, my night times were so bad. I mean, they were so bad. I would wake up screaming, gasping for air, pouring of sweat, waking up reactive like this, like I thought someone was going to hurt me in some way. They was awful. It was so bad. So bad it got to the point that I was actually petrified to go sleep. And I used to stay up until I could not stay awake any longer. So sometimes I'd be awake till 12 o'clock midday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I'd be holding my eyes open to try not to fall asleep. It was literally as bad as that. And eventually, through finding the right medications through my counselling and the counselling as well, started to help me just to level just a touch. There were still very, very bad nights, and I mean very bad nights. But little did I know that these flashbacks was then going to start turning into images of people and places. So, for example, I started seeing people in my head, in my mind's eye, like a video in my mind. At that particular time, though, I just thought I was imagining it. I thought I was away with the fairies. It's the only way I can describe it. I'd watch TV, but no one was home. It's the only way I can describe it. My eyes are on the TV, but I'm not taking any of it in. I'm watching the picture show in here. So again, over time, there was a lot of question marks around this because I realise now I'm clairvoyant. So clairvoyant means to see and to see the unseen. However, I wasn't able to hear as such, and I didn't understand. As a clairvoyant, you have to say what you see, and that's what spirit was trying to communicate with me and to me, but I didn't understand that at the time because I didn't even know that I was a psychic and a medium. I had no idea. So obviously at this particular point, I'm getting all these images and I'm not really understanding them all at the time. One of the reasons I didn't understand them is because I never got to meet any of my grandparents, not on my mum's side and not on my dad's side. I didn't get to meet any of them. So this then led me to starting to need to understand who's who in my family. Bearing in mind I grew up abandoned. There was only really mum and dad plus my foster parents. And it led me feeling like I didn't know who I was. I didn't know where I belonged. I didn't understand what my roots was, where I'd come from. So I started to do things like ancestry tree and started to try and understand who was who on my tree, who my granddad was on my mum's side, and my grandma, and again the same on my dad's side. And started to kind of come off that a little bit, great grandparents, uncles, aunties, things like that. Not realising that my mum was from a huge family. And with my mum being Irish, she was one of 11 siblings. 7 of them was in Ireland and 4 of them was over here in Leicester. Now, it started to help me to understand who was who because the thing is, I knew I had an uncle, but I didn't realise that his brothers and sisters was also my uncles and aunties because my mum had never really spoken about them. So I didn't really know. And it was only when talking to my uncle as we got a little bit older, he's like, that's your uncle too, and that's your auntie, etc., etc. So I always felt lost and lonely, like my world was very small and the people was in it was very small. So again, going back to the ancestry tree, I needed to understand who was who on my tree. And when I started to get a name, for instance, of who my nan was, who my granddad was, I started to be able to see images from this. So, for instance, my mum's mum, when I would tune into that, I'd get this picture in my head. And I'd get this picture and I could describe this person very, very easily. And the same with her father, and the same again with my dad's side. Only problem was, I wasn't talking to my parents at the time. So I'm getting these images, but I'm able to communicate with them now. I understand that's their names and this is what they look like. So I've got a description. So this starts to help me. Anyway, coming back, so I'm doing my ancestry tree. I'm going through the social services records, as I mentioned earlier, trying to piece things together, trying to understand who I am, where I've come from, what I've been through, etc., etc. So I've got all these things going on at once. Now, at this particular point, there was a point there where I got quite overwhelmed with things. I got carried away with things. The anger was taking over from what I was seeing and what I was reading and how I felt I'd been treated. And as a grown man by this point, I thought, I'm not going to allow some of these things. I need to understand why. So I started asking questions. One of my first things that I did was absolutely huge. This was a moment where I took my power back, but I didn't realise it at the time. And as I mentioned earlier, the person that when I was 9 to 11 that done those things to me, well, I found out where he lived. And so I decided to go and knock on his door. I just decided one night, I'd gone on my bike, I felt really down and just went for it. So when I'm actually pedalling down there, I wasn't driving. So I'm pedalling down there, pedalled about 7 miles, which was quite a lot. In my head, there's so many things that I'm thinking. I mean, a lot of things that I'm thinking that when they answer the door, what I'm going to say or what I'm going to do. So I end up just knocking the door, and he opens the door, and he says to me, "Who are you?" And they answer. And I say, "You know who I am." And obviously I repeated my name. And he looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. At that particular point, I then told him what I thought of him as a person and what a disgusting human being I thought he was. And I wasn't going to leave his doorstep until he admitted what he was. That P word. And to admitted what he was. And I told him that I wasn't going anywhere until he admitted what he'd done. After about a few minutes, he kept saying, I'm closing the door. I said, "You're not. You're going to face up to this fella." And I made it very clear that I wasn't going anywhere until he eventually admitted what he was and repeated what he was. And at that particular point, in my head, I'm hearing, and bearing in mind, remember I said I see, but this time I'm hearing, think of your kids. Think of your kids. Because in my head, So in my head, I'm trying my best to think of my kids, to not do anything that would affect my children by doing anything silly. So I didn't. I told him what I thought of him. I told him that I knew where he lived now and I wasn't happy with him. And let's just say that I told him that he should be careful, is probably one way of putting it. And at that moment, I then decided it was time to leave before I did anything that I would regret. So then I started pedalling back. But after about a mile, my bike broke. The pedals broke. Don't know how. I think it was Spirit. I think Spirit had decided that I needed to calm down. And so I ended up having to walk 6 miles home at this point. And I was angry. Seeing this person's face had upset me massively. And I eventually I eventually got home, where I got home and I just fell to the floor. Not because I was tired or exhausted, but because of what I just put myself through. Little did I realise at that point, although it was a very difficult moment for me facing this person, in that moment too, that is where I took my power back. That is where I decided that I was taking all the power back that I'd lost from this person for the things that they'd done to me. At that point, things started to change in my life. Yes, there was still anger. Yes, there was still frustration. So I wasn't a healed version, of course. But I'd managed to face this person. I'd managed to tell them what was needed to be said. So again, I've come home, I've kind of collapsed on the floor. I've obviously got emotional. I've got really upset. I've actually felt physically sick. I wasn't physically sick, but I felt it, as you can imagine. And then over time, I was then sort of stuck because this person had linked to my mum and dad. It was my mum and dad's friend. And, well, mainly my dad's actually. And then at this particular point, pardon me, at this particular point, Spirit kept saying to me, you need to reach out to your mum. Time's ticking. I thought, what do you mean time's ticking? So they showed me. They showed me that she had some health issues. They told me it was a lung or lungs. And they told me that time was ticking. And I didn't have a massive amount of time. They didn't tell me how long. They just kept saying time's ticking. So obviously I dwelled on this for quite a while. Shall I? Shan't I? What will I say? How do I say it? Then I decided that it was time to reach out. And I found a couple of addresses for them online. And so me and my friend, we drove towards Lincolnshire, where they lived at the time. And we knocked the addresses that we could find. However, both the addresses there was no longer living at. I asked the neighbours, did they know? They said, sorry, but we've not seen them. They moved out. We've not seen them. So at this point, I'm not sure whether they're alive or gone. I've got no idea. I try looking online for birth certificates, death certificates. I try looking for all that stuff. Can't find anything. Just wasn't sure if it had not been processed yet. So at this point, I wasn't sure if there was past. Then, my partner, her best friend, she's talking to her best friend and saying how I feel. I'd been looking for me mum and dad and blah, blah, blah. And it just so happens, how this is synchronicity, it just so happens that my partner's best friend, her new boyfriend, was friends with a gentleman that was friends with my dad. He was basically, his dad was the best friend of my dad. It was mad. So he then contacted my dad, got my dad's phone number. And then I took a little bit of time over this and thought about what do I say, how do I say it? And thought about ringing him. Now, I thought about it for a long, long time. Wasn't sure what to do or how to do it. But in this particular time period, Spirit is saying to me, Carl, you need to take time out and you need to look back, connect with your granddad and your grandma on your mum's side and your dad's side. Okay, why? You need to understand, Carl, what their journey is and what they've gone through. Okay. So I decide then, firstly, to connect with my mum's family, connect with her mum and dad. And so I'd go and connect with Spirit, take time, go into this deep, deep connection with them. And I come back and I realise that my mum's gone through a lot of deep trauma. And I mean a lot. There were similarities, is one way I can put it. There was abandonment. Her mum had left her in Ireland and came to England to get away from her dad. But there was also the abuse there too. I'm like, okay. Then Spirit said, you need to do the same with your dad. Okay. So I decided then to connect with my dad's parents, bearing in mind I'd never met them on the earth plane, and just had to trust in what I got from Spirit. So again, I connected with my nan and my granddad, bearing in mind my dad had never met his dad, didn't even know the name of his dad, but I was already told what he was called. So I connected with them. And when I connected with them, there was a similar story. There was abandonment, there was rejection, and again, there was abuse. And so then I started to realise is that our stories, they was quite similar. My mum and dad couldn't possibly know how to help me because they didn't know how to help themselves. Because their own traumas, they'd not even healed themselves. Spirit had also said to me within this, they said that your dad, he had a sister, and his sister was sent away because of what happened to his sister. And his sister tried to tell the mum, but the mum kind of didn't believe her and sent her away. So my dad said the last time he'd seen him was at 5 years old, but I didn't know this at the time. So his spirit had given me all this information, telling me about his sister, which he'd never done. They told me what his stepfather had tried to do to him. I didn't know why they did, but they did. So this is the point now where I decide I'm going to call my mum and dad. So I called. My mum was in hospital at the time, and I think she'd had a stroke. So I called my dad, and he was like, "What do you want?" And I was like, "Well, I thought maybe it's about time that we spoke. Nothing to talk about." And he was kind of like that, and I'm like, "Well, I think we need to talk. It's been like 14 years, and I think we need to talk about some of the things." And he just basically kept cutting me short and telling me that he didn't want to talk to me, and that was that. He was just about to put the phone down when I said to him, "Dad, I know that your name wasn't Mark when you was born. I know that your name was John. I know what happened to your sister. I know why she went. And I also know what happened with your stepdad." He paused and went, how do you know this? How do you know this? And at that point, I went on to tell him that I was now someone that could learn how to connect to spirit, and that his mum and dad had given me this information. And they told me what he'd gone through, how he'd gone through it. And I mentioned his sister, I mentioned the name of his sister, and he was quite stunned. Stunned to the point that he didn't put the phone down. That was what prevented him putting the phone down. And at that particular time, we then ended up carrying on talking on the phone and talking about other things as well. Maybe a week or so later, I think my mum was out of hospital, and I managed to talk to my mum the first time, bearing in mind what Spirit had told me previously. Time was ticking. So obviously I was aware that she wasn't well. It was kind of weird that when I rang her up, she was actually in hospital. I'm thinking, whoa, I know they said time's ticking, but like, wow. So obviously she's in hospital. So I then started to understand that the situation with my mum and dad, as much as I was hurt, as much as I wasn't looked after or supported, I knew that for whatever reason, I had to learn to put the past behind me. I had to learn to forgive and let go for my own sake. Not for their sake, but for my own sake. I had to let go. And I understood that there was never going to be the parents that I wanted them to be. and I just had to accept the version that they was offering. Now, after 14 years, there was a lot of changes in the relationship. The way that my mum was and the way that my dad was. Every time my mum would ring me, she'd tell me she loved me every single time. Something she never did in the previous days. She'd always say, I love you, all the time. Again, my dad, he'd be coming, he'd come to my house and he'd bring up samosas and onion barges. We'd talk on the phone for an hour. So although there was no affection, if you like, in the sense of physical, we was on talking terms and I could see that the relationship had changed. So I thought that it was best that I didn't bring up the other stuff. At this point, my mum's 70. My dad's 77. And I didn't think that it would benefit me from this point to bring it up. And I had to accept the version that was left of them. This made it really, really easier to reconnect with them. Now, shortly after, so obviously I'm talking to my mum, I'm talking to my dad. And not long after starting to talk to her, she ended up in a hospital. So she'd fallen out of bed and she'd broken a hip, and she'd already had a hip replacement. So she'd knocked the hip replacement out, and she ended up in hospital, which at that particular point, I'd been working as a psychic for years by then. And I knew that this was not good. I knew that this was closer to the end for whatever reason. I wasn't sure it was that particular moment, but I knew that it wasn't long. I knew that whatever was going to happen wasn't that far away. She ended up with a lot of issues. She got a blood clot on her lung. She got sepsis, which I remember her telling me. She said, I thought I was a goner. She had diabetes. And eventually, she had COPD as well. And I think she was eating. She inhaled some food. Must have started coughing when she was eating. It basically went into her lung, and there was an issue with the lung. They couldn't re-inflate the lung, and they kept her on a machine for about a week, give or take, trying to get to re-inflate this lung. And whilst all this was going on, she had a heart attack too. And she tried to hang on for as long as she could, but she just couldn't. And obviously they had to make a decision at the end to turn the machine off. And that was, so from talking to her to her passing, there was 18 months. And within that 18 months, she was in a hospital, at least 12 of them. So it was, video calls and things like that, seeing her on video call. We live 100 miles away, or did. And so that was really, really difficult. But I'm glad that I got the chance to heal the relationship with my mum before she passed. Because if not, I think I would have been someone that would have still been angry and still been bitter. And I'm so glad that Spirit gave me the information about my mum, that what she went through, to help me learn to forgive her, for her to understand she may not have healed, and that's why she couldn't help me. She was too triggered when she heard what I went through and how, it affected me as a child. And also going back to about the time that I went into care in children's homes. And for all those years, thinking I'd been, just not wanted, if you like. I started to look at the situation differently. She had polio. She had epilepsy. She had 17 operations on her leg. She had mental health issues because she'd lost my brother and my sister. Both of those had passed within 2 years. And she wasn't in a good place. And so she had to do what she had to do to put me in a place, not because she didn't necessarily want me, but because she couldn't have me. She knew that she giving me to social services, she thought she was giving me a better chance with somebody else. And so it wasn't because I was necessarily unwanted or unloved. It was because she couldn't. Pardon me. And with her having polio, back in the day, the operations on her legs, I think she had 17. I think there was 17 operations on her legs, so it was pretty harsh. A lot of recoveries. And so I started to look at the abandonment and rejection slightly different, and started to understand that, yes, I went into care, but it wasn't necessarily for the reasons that I thought at the time. There was something else that really, really helped me as well. Again, I'm still going through some of this healing process, and I remember sitting in this exact room, and obviously I was going through a lot of the sort of thoughts and flashbacks in my head, and Spirit said something to me that literally made me change with a new perspective, just like that. They said to me, Carl, although you are a victim, you don't have to feel like a victim. And that was something that made me get out of this chair and say, I ain't no longer going to feel like a victim. I'm a grown man, and I don't have to feel like a victim anymore. It doesn't mean that I'm not. I just don't have to feel like it. And that's the difference. You see, focusing on the past is only going to make you feel like the past. Now, as a psychic, I understand that every memory has got emotions connected to it. So when I used to be back and forwards in my head, focusing on things from the past, it used to bring all those feelings and emotions back, because not only was I tuning into the memory, but the emotion. And so I started to learn that what I thought or focused on is exactly what I was going to feel. So I started to understand that I had to be more present. I had to do a lot of shadow work. And I remember a gentleman that I came across that does hypnotherapy, and his name is Mark. And I went to see Mark, and he did hypnotherapy for me. And that helped me as well. But there was something else that he helped me with, which I thought was brilliant. And he told me again, kind of going through this regression, just to close your eyes. And he said, now I want you to, when you close your eyes, I want you to imagine a safe place. So whenever you think of this place, it's your safe place. And I could imagine this field with these like purple flowers, like meadows, and sort of like this wooden hut. And he said, now what I want you to do, Carl, is I want you to visualize the child version of yourself standing next to the adult version of yourself. I said, okay. And he said, now what I want you to do, I want you to go up to the young version of you, and I want you to hug him, and I want you to make him feel the safety that you needed to feel when you was a child. I want you to say all the things to him that he needed to hear. I want you to make him feel safe. Tell him he's loved. Tell him he's safe. Tell him he's protected. Tell him no one's going to hurt him, because the adult version of you is going to protect him. And I realised it was my inner child that I needed to work on. And so the adult version of me gave the younger version of me all this comfort. And whenever I feel that sort of vulnerability again, I take myself back to that place. I visualise that place, visualise the young version of me, and visualise the older version of me comforting and loving him and keeping him safe and letting him know that nothing's ever going to hurt him like that again. So I hope some of these tips also help you guys in this show. The other thing that sort of happened with this was not so long ago. Obviously now we're in January, but only in November my dad passed away. And it was such a difficult one. He was told in June, July that he got lung cancer. And he tried to put on a brave face about it, but I knew that deep down how he was really feeling. And it was difficult because we'd started to talk more. We'd started to sort of get a little bit closer and try and not talk about the past and put the past behind us. And then all of a sudden, it was he was gone. So it was 2 years after my mum had passed. My dad passed as well, and so it was a really strange feeling that I'd reached out to them. We'd had a chance to heal the relationship and put the past behind us, so there was no hatred towards each other. And just after we managed to do that, that was it. He had his cancer and he passed away. So it's been a difficult few months, even going through the grief stage. But what I do know is that going through this awakening stage for myself is what saved me. Understanding the visions that Spirit gave me to help me to look at things from a different perspective. Not everything is always the way that it seems. And helping me to understand that the fact that, when I was in care as a child, it wasn't always for the reasons that I may have thought it was. And yes, I should have been protected more in my younger years, 100%. But what I also did, because I was someone that was quite angry for a while, coming through this, when it was pointed out to me that if I allowed my triggers to keep affecting me, that means that the chains of trauma was being passed on to my children, and I wasn't going to allow that to happen any longer. So I decided I needed to break those chains of trauma and not allow my triggers to affect my family or my children anymore. So breaking that ancestral trauma, not allowing it to affect them, because there was times in my younger years as a younger dad, it affected me massively. But I got to a point when it was pointed out to me, Carl, your triggers, your children are seeing. They're seeing the way that you're acting. They're seeing the way that you're saying things or doing things, and they're going to see how you behave to that. And you've got to try to change the way that you act, the way that you respond, to allow your children to not be affected by your own trauma. This was a motivation for me. It was a motivation for me to stop any more trauma getting anywhere near my family. We'd had enough. And so with all the awakening and the guidance by Spirit, for them telling me how to look at things differently, not to focus on certain things, how to reach out to my mum or my dad, and all these things helped me to heal where I am today. So anyone else that's gone through any sort of trauma in their life that's been difficult for them, and they don't know how it's going to get better, they don't know how to change, let me promise you this. I was that person at the very, very bottom. The only way was up for me. There was no other way. I'd hit the absolute bottom. And I hope that somewhere out there, there's somebody that takes some inspiration from my story and helps them to keep going. Because I had no idea that all these years later, I was going to be a psychic medium. I was going to be having all these followers on all my social media pages. I was going to be doing a podcast. I had no idea. All I knew is that I had to keep going, and Spirit have helped me all the way. So I hope that all of you have enjoyed today. If anyone wants to get in touch with the show, feel free. I gave the wrong email last week, so I'm going to try better this week. The Spiritual Hour Podcast at gmail.com. So if you do want to get in touch with us, feel free to get in touch by the email. You can also find all my social media pages through my link tree, which you'll find in my bio, depending on which platform that you're watching this on. As I've mentioned before, I do private readings. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, I do them by video call. If it is something you're interested in, again, you can get in touch with me. But I really hope that you guys enjoyed today's podcast, and I hope that it gave you some inspiration. Yes, I've gone through a lot. Yes, there's been a lot of traumas, but I've come through it and I've come through it stronger. And as a psychic and a medium, I'm now able to see traumas in readings very easy, because as a psychic and a medium, through our life experiences, we're able to see these things in readings easier. So as a clairvoyant, I see, and I'm able to see these things in a reading and recognize the energy of a trauma. So I don't always see the trauma, but I'll see a trauma box, and it helped me to understand what they've gone through, what guidance they might need, and how they can move forward. So guys, until next week, again, I hope you all enjoyed it. Drop us a comment. Let me know if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all again next week. I'm Grey Wolf Psychic Medium, and I'll see you again next week.